Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. We have a great program tonight, and we're really lucky to have two incredible people, nationally known for their expertise on the topic of polarization, and we will be starting the program soon. But before, I would like to urge all of you to submit your questions throughout the program. Questions are very important to us. We learn a lot from your questions, and we hope that you'll continue to provide them throughout the program. And now it's going to be my pleasure and honor to introduce you to Professor Susan Herbst, who will serve as facilitator, as well as provide some context on the subject of polarization. So she's got a pretty good resume. You might have seen it when you registered for this program, but here I go. Susan is the former president of the University of Connecticut and has returned to the faculty. She teaches at the Stanford campus, where she is university professor of political science and president emeritus. Prior to her presidency, Susan served as executive vice chancellor and chief academic officer of the University System of Georgia, where she led 15 university presidents and oversaw the academic missions of all 35 public universities in Georgia. And before Georgia, she was provost and executive vice president at the University of Albany, SUNY, and acting president as well. Prior to that, she served as the dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Temple University. So thank you, Susan. We welcome you back to us. We're really grateful you're here, and we turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rhoda, for organizing this session, but also for all you do and your organization does to support education and democratic action. So it's vitally important. So we're really fortunate to have Professor Marc Hetherington here tonight, and I'll introduce him in a minute. He'll speak, I'll have some questions, and then look forward to seeing yours in the chat and posing those to him. So you can start whenever you'd like to put questions in the chat, and I'll keep track of those. So as Rhoda mentioned, our topic tonight is political polarization, no doubt one of the greatest threats to democracy. Battling coherent parties is one thing, but extreme, hateful, uncivil, unproductive polarization is another, and very dangerous here in 2022. So in America, we've always had factions, and we've had fierce ones in our politics. George Washington worried about how internal dissent could rip a new nation apart, and that was prescient. But we've had other horrendous periods, of course. The 1850s led to a civil war. The 1930s, which is one of my areas of study, were very fraught as well. Those of you who are alive in 1968, one of the worst years in American history, know that the country felt divided and terrifying in the years before that and after that. More recently, things are different. We now have key national actors building on cultural tendencies that are already deep in America, changing the nature and the texture of elite politics in Washington, to encourage polarization of the populace, of larger public opinion. So I'm not being partisan at this moment. I'm just pointing out effective strategy. Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, then Karl Rove and others in the 2000s, they pioneered a new sort of partisanship. You know, call the other side, again, strategic, call the other side traitors, call them cheaters, call them liars. They are an enemy that must be destroyed. And it works. Labeling the other side un-American or hating our country are now common tropes in our rhetoric. So my students often say, this is a kind of aggravating, well, then America's always been this way since the Civil War. We've always been divided. We've always been cruel. We've always been mean. We always hated on each other. And I explain to them that these currents have been here, but we are in 2022 in a qualitatively, profoundly different world. Technologically, regard to our media, and culturally. So it's a unique world that they have to understand. They can't just say, well, it's always been this way. But we need more scholarly expertise. So Marc Hetherington is Raymond H. Dawson Distinguished Bicentennial Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before that, he taught at Vanderbilt, at Bowdoin College, University of Virginia. His doctorate is in government from a very fine department at the University of Texas, Austin. It would take all night to list his many books, articles, awards, all in the general field of public opinion, parties in American politics, and parties in America and political dynamics more generally. I'm a huge fan of his work. I have been for years, so it's been a pleasure for me to finally see him sort of in person online. And I urge you to just visit his website, easy to find in the political science department at Chapel Hill. He has two particularly outstanding books, are Why Washington Won't Work, Polarization, Political Trust, and the Governing Crisis, and also Authoritarianism and Polarization in America, both of which have won important prizes in our field. So we're very fortunate that Marc has time for us tonight. And Marc, the floor is yours.
Susan, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody, here. Just by way of background, I come to political science from a really different place than I think most political scientists do. My dad was a long-time, decades-long political hand in Pennsylvania, working his way through Republican Party politics from the 1950s all the way up until the 1990s. He was the press secretary for a U.S. senator. So I come to politics from like the political science from the politics side of things. And I hope that my research, in that sense, appeals to people beyond just political science. So I'm going to talk with you all about some of the things that I've been doing and thinking about. But the key central feature is this idea of why are we so polarized now? As Susan pointed out, Americans have been Americans for a really long time. And what is there's something different about today, as she said, something qualitatively different, something that we can both feel but also measure. And one thing I want you guys to keep the audience to keep in mind as we're going through this talk, and you all are probably better people than I am, but as human beings, sometimes we like people, sometimes we don't, and then sometimes we really hate them. And what I want you all to have in the back of your mind is, when you really hate someone, and again, I know you probably don't, I do, but anyway, when you really hate someone, what would you be willing to do? What do you want to see happen to them when push comes to shove? Because I think this is one of the things that's happened in American politics today. So I am going to share my screen with you. I'm going to give probably a 25-minute PowerPoint presentation pointing up, some of the things that I think are most important to what's going on these days. So let me share my screen. And if anybody has any issues here, just jump up and down and tell us, we can't see the screen. Seeing none of it jumping up and down. I just want to give you all a sense of, the fact that, this is not a minor thing, what we're going through in the US these days. It feels like we ought to just be able to get along, but we can't. And I'm going to try to explain why that is. So the thing that orients my talk is going to be this: how can partisanship be so powerful today that it would seem to have life and death consequences? So, when Susan and I went to graduate school, and when probably most of the audience was growing up, what we worried about was people didn't care enough about politics, that people didn't follow things closely, that people didn't know anything. Well, the worst of all worlds has happened in American politics. We still don't know anything, actually. All the data suggests that even with exploding levels of education and increasing access to information, we're no better on the political facts than we used to be. So we're ignorant still, but we feel like we know, exactly how things are. And it's creating, this set of circumstances. And what I'm going to argue today is that it's the nature of the partisan divide that leaves Republicans and Democrats not able to understand each other. And actually, by the numbers, I'll show data suggesting we hate each other, in fact. And it's a really difficult set of circumstances to overcome. But I'm going to provide at least a few ideas at the end of the talk that, hopefully give us some ideas about what types of things might help us overcome this polarization. So you probably didn't expect that you would come to a political science talk and there would be a poem. But I'm going to start with a poem because this is a poem that on the stump in 2016 that Donald Trump was fond of reciting to his throngs. And of course, his throngs were conservative, sort of populist political followers, he being the political leader. And of course, you might remember in 2016, among the big issues were immigration. How much immigration should we allow into the United States? And also the refugee crisis in Syria. Are we going to allow refugees into the country? So, with this said, in the context of those two issues, Trump used to provide a reading of Oscar Brown's old poem and later a song. And it's based on one of Aesop's fables from, of course, centuries ago. And again, it's called The Snake, and it reveals what I think is a worldview. And what I'm going to suggest is that the worldview that Trump supporters have is quite opposed to the worldview of people who would be on the other side of the political divide. And what it's going to provide us an understanding of, using this metaphor here, is why we just don't get each other. Okay, so the poem starts out with, on her way to work one morning, down the path alongside the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor half-frozen snake. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. Oh, well, she cried, I'll take you in and I'll take care of you. Things don't actually go well from there for the tender-hearted woman. She is bitten by this snake, despite her efforts to revive it. And she is unhappy with this turn of circumstances and says, I saved you, cried that woman, and you've bit me, even why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die. Oh, shut up, silly woman, said the reptile with a grin. You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in. So this reading draws incredible response from the Trump audience. They go crazy. He said it at he said the poem at the CPAC conference, and almost looked like a professional wrestler in advance of it, getting the crowd, do you want me to read the poem, and doing this sort of call and response thing about it. So this is something that really resonates with people on the political right. And I think to that group, the story is you can't be too careful. Immigrants and refugees, everything might be fine if we invite them into the country, but might turn out that they're snakes and they bite us and we die. Okay. Now, let's think about this as in terms of the other side of the worldview divide. Now, people who see the world differently, not as, so dangerous, it's not a clarion call to common sense. Immigrants and refugees are unlikely to harm us in the other worldview's view. They are more inclined to see this as a disgusting incitement of prejudice. Immigrants and refugees are people, they're not snakes. But what you can see here is that the solution for one side of the worldview divide creates the problem for the other. If you're on the conservative side of the worldview divide, the solution to the problem is to keep immigrants out. Well, if you're on the opposite side of that divide, you see that as being prejudice. But if you're on the side that sees it as prejudice, your solution is to let people in. And those on the other side of the worldview divide say, hey, you might as well be dumping a bunch of snakes in my living room. So the solution for one side creates the problem for the other. And you can see this again and again, whether it has to do with terrorism or whether it has to do with LGBT rights or any number of things. Shouldn't we just stick with the tried and true versus, hey, wait a minute, the tried and true wasn't so good for certain groups. This is the dynamic that we run against. Two worldviews that really don't understand how the other sees politics. Well, this actually raises an interesting question. Hasn't it always been that way? Haven't there always been these different worldviews, people who see the world as more safe and people who see the world as more dangerous? Well, that's true, but that's not always how politics has been divided up. You know, Susan made reference to the 1930s and what we might refer to as the New Deal party divide. And this is the divide that probably almost all of the audience grew up with. It was certainly the one that I grew up with in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And the key distinction between the parties back then was how involved government would be in the economic marketplace. So the fights between Republicans and Democrats were between free enterprise and more government regulation, business versus labor, fewer government programs, more government programs, higher taxes, lower taxes. Now, these are all technical issues in a way. You experience them in your head. You don't necessarily feel them. Some people feel them, but you have to be kind of a political expert in order to do it. And you think about this, you can easily come up with compromises along these lines. A little more regulation, a little less regulation, a little more taxes, a little less taxes. But that politics has been swept aside over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And we, in my book with Jonathan Weiler, refer to this as the worldview party divide. And the issues that animate this divide, where whether we see the world as safe or less safe, these are the types of things that we really experience in our guts because, survival is at stake. And the types of issues that are important for our worldviews to help us understand our preferences occur on issues like race and gender equality and law and order and sexual orientation, immigration, terrorism. These are all things you experience in your guts, not your head. And, thinking about, well, how do we come up with a compromise on gender equality or racial equality or sexual orientation equality? Those are difficult compromises to come by. Now, what the rise of these issues have created is a new divide between Republicans and Democrats. Now, there have always been Republican groups and there have always been Democrat groups, but the types of issues that place people on either side of the party divide, the issues that motivate that create the groups that end up being opposed to one another, the demographic groups. So what these days we have, and this is different from the New Deal party divide, we have a giant racial divide where whites vote about 20 percentage points more Republican than Democrat, whereas non-whites vote more like 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican. There's a gender difference, there's religious differences, there's city versus country differences. But what I think they all boil down to on one level or another is the traditional versus the novel. These groups over here are the traditional groups, the groups that have traditionally held power. White people, men, especially Christian religious groups, the yeoman sort of country idea. And these are groups that are, pushing for change because they haven't held power. Non-whites, women, seculars. When I was a kid, there was no such thing as seculars, but the country is increasingly so. The city, these are all novel things. Now I'm going to add a layer onto that, and that is it produces some really strange divides that just, when we across political lines think different things about tradition versus novelty, we end up with divides that transcend politics. So actually, it turns out that Republicans and Democrats differ in their food preferences and their beer preferences. Their family sizes are different. The cars they like to drive are different. They listen to different music. They read different types of books. They enjoy different types of sports. But again, what most of these things seem to boil down to is the same thing: traditional choices versus novel choices. So Republicans like American food. That's the usual thing. Republicans eat more meat. Democrats eat more vegetables. Light macro brews, that's the established breweries. If you go to a bar sometime over the weekend and run into someone with a really dark beer in front of them, you can guess that's a Democrat. You'll be pretty safe. Okay, so not only do we disagree then on the politics, we disagree, it feels like, on everything. So let me try to illustrate this in a couple of, kind of fun ways. Even the things that we agree on, we don't agree on. Republicans and Democrats, we both like dogs, but even the dogs that we like are different. This is my dog. He's barely a dog. I know, he weighs 25 pounds. He's on the furniture. He can't keep anybody safe from anything. But he's really cute and he's really sweet. And he's like an equal in our family. Now, I have a really close friend named Randy Zabel, who I went to graduate school with at Texas. And his worldview is really different from mine. Doesn't mean that we're not really good friends. We just see the world differently. And this is his dog. Now, his dog, he could eat my dog. Of course, he has to be well behaved. He has to be obedient, because if he wasn't, he would rip the house limb to limb. But, again, even when we agree, dogs are great. Even our choices of those seem to be a little bit different. I've talked about different things about cars, and, the name of the book that I most recently did is called Prius or Pickup. And, of course, Democrats are much more like, you think about it, if you look out the window and you see somebody climbing into a Prius, we're hardwired to make these connections, and we do about politics and non-political things. You see someone getting into a Prius and you think Democrat. You see somebody getting into a giant pickup truck with a gun rack and you think Republican. Those things might not be true, but it feels like they're true. And they're pretty true, actually, too. But here's the big thing. It's not really the fact that Democrats and Republicans drive different cars and stuff like that. It's the inferences that we draw about people when they make these choices that are different from ours. So I think this quote from Dan Pera, who's a conservative blogger talking about the Prius, really captures this. It's not just that, liberals drive Priuses. It's this: we all know it's the car of choice of liberals everywhere. They're as much a political statement as anything. By driving one of these cars, these folks are saying, I care more about everything than you, and you hate the environment and support torture. What Dan is saying here is, your car choice is a political statement. And if among those who are making this political statement, they're judging me. They are judging me as the kind of a person that I am, because I don't drive a car like them. And, surely a bit of that judgment is actually true and taking place. But I want you to feel, what I want you to again go back to is this: in your personal life, when you feel like people are judging you, what is your reaction to feeling like you're being judged by others? And it's not a positive thing. It doesn't feel very good. And it probably makes you feel really negatively towards the people who you feel like are judging you. So we're making all of these different lifestyle choices, and we come from different groups that we feel like are judging us for various choices that we make. And so the non-political is making the political divide even more problematic. So let's get to some data. So back before the 2016 election, a guy at what is now called YouGov, Doug Rivers, asked the following survey question to a nationally representative sample of Americans. And it asked people to choose between one of two things. Which comes closest to your view? On the one hand, do you feel like our lives are threatened by terrorists, criminals, and immigrants, and our priority should be to protect ourselves? Or is your view more like it's a big, beautiful world, mostly full of good people, and we must find a way to embrace each other and not allow ourselves to become isolated? Now, what we see here is that among Clinton supporters, 80% said, basically about 80%, that it's a big, beautiful world, Only about 15% thinks the priority ought to be to protect ourselves, and a few aren't sure. And among Trump supporters, almost 80% of them think it's most important to protect ourselves first. Only about 15% say embrace each other. And again, the rest not sure. Now, in the social sciences, you don't see relationships like this very often. This is pretty remarkable. So what it's saying to me is, let's go back to the snake again. Is the world a dangerous place? Yeah, man, we're threatened by terrorists, criminals, and immigrants. We got to protect ourselves. That's the top priority. Versus the other side of the worldview divide. It's big, beautiful world. We got to embrace each other. It's not so dangerous out there. The worst thing is becoming isolated. All right, so I think we're starting to see some evidence that this is the key fault line between modern day Republicans and Democrats. Now, one of the things that came up after our book came out in 2018 is threatened by what? Our lives are threatened. Didn't it seem like liberals were much more concerned about the most recent threats that face the nation, specifically COVID-19? And what we came to do some follow-up research on is that conservatives seem to be feel more threat from things that can be personified, that are, people, criminals, terrorists, immigrants. Liberals are not, the most unthreatened people. They're fearful too. We're all anxious of certain things. And in fact, liberals are probably more anxious than conservatives are. But the things that worry them are more systemic forces, viruses, climate, words, and things along those lines. But politics has been more, until COVID, dominated by concerns about terrorists, criminals, and immigrants than it has been about other things. So what we imagine is two different worldviews. We create two different ideas for worldviews. The fixed worldview on the one hand, and by fixed, I don't mean that these people's ideas are fixed in place, because both sides of the worldview divide have ideas that are fixed in place, because those are their worldviews. By fixed, what we mean is that they don't think that the world should change that much. Change could be dangerous. It might be great, but it could be dangerous. So the mantra for people who we think of as having a fixed worldview, the folks who delighted in the snake when Trump read it, their view of the world is, the world's a dangerous place. We should follow directions. We should rely on traditions and hierarchies to provide us order, make the world predictable. When we think about the outside world, it's important to be vigilant. We should that'll keep us safe, and we need to be watchful of them. Those thems might be dangerous. Social change, physical threats are a concern. That's one worldview. That's the worldview of people who are going to listen to the snake and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's common sense. Then you have the fluid worldview people. Their mantra is, the world is fun. The world, we should go out and explore it. You should follow your own path. You shouldn't be worried. So being not so wary allows people to be more open to new experiences. They like things that are unconventional. In fact, they dislike traditions. When they think about conventions and traditions, that to them is conformity. So they favor the personal, letting everybody be themselves, as opposed to the community, because the community sometimes, doesn't let people be themselves in the way that maybe they would like to be. So how do we measure this? Now, this is one of the things. So with survey research, we have to measure these concepts. We have worldviews, fixed and fluid. How are we going to get people to reveal this to us when we do research in surveys? I can't ask somebody, hey, is your worldview fixed? They have no idea what that means. So what we have to do is come up with ways to unlock these, kind of concepts that are, a little intangible. And this is the way we do it with worldviews. And this was an idea that Paul Snyderman came up with in the 1980s and Stanley Feldman perfected in the early 1990s. And we ask people, we don't ask them about politics at all. You'll note the word liberal isn't in here, the word conservative isn't in here, Republican isn't, Democrat isn't. Instead, we ask people about desirable qualities in children. So we start the question by asking, although there are a number of qualities that people feel that children should have, every person thinks that some are more important than others. I'm going to read you pairs of desirable qualities. Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have. So I'm a parent. I have 2 kids. I want all 8 of these things. It kind of depends on when, but I want all 8. But what if I had to choose? Would I choose independence or respect for elders? Would I choose good manners or curiosity? And what you can see here is that, the fluid choice is independence, curiosity, being considerate, and being self-reliant. And the fixed choices are, if people say, respect for elders, good manners, being well-behaved, and obedience. And you can score it anywhere in between, but I'm just going to focus on the people who give all 4 fluid answers or all 4 fixed answers. Okay, so remember how I started the talk by saying politics has changed. The New Deal divide is different from the one today. And let me show you that I'm right. Back in 1992, whether you were fluid or fixed had no influence on your politics in terms of whether you chose to be a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. Okay. Republicans and Democrats were equally likely to be fixed. Democrats were equally likely to be either fluid or fixed. Republicans were equally likely to be either fluid or fixed. Same with independents. But by 2020, we've gotten sorted out where people with a fluid worldview almost all pick the Democrats, 70% of them. And if you're fixed, you almost always choose the Republican Party, 70% of them. So in other words, think about what the implications of this are. Think about these questions. Partisans disagree on the most fundamental things in life: how kids should be, whether they should respect or be independent, whether they should have good manners or curiosity. But these reveal our worldviews. Do we have a worldview that's more hierarchical, where there's a lot of order? Order gives us security, or do we favor a worldview that's more horizontal, where more anything goes? And of course, now that is deeply connected to the parties. I should add that being fixed or fluid informs people's ideas on the issue all of the issues that divide us deeply. Knowing how fixed or fluid people are in their worldview tells us about their preferences in politics for military intervention, how egalitarian their racial attitudes are, how they feel about immigration, gender equality, gun control, LGBT issues, constitutional interpretation, how to keep the country safe from terrorism, support for civil liberties, all the big ones. So, this feeling that we have deep down inside about whether hierarchy or independence is more important, whether safety and security or searching and independence is more important, is what divides us. I mean, it's always divided us as people, but now it divides us one party from the other. The results are this, and this is where I'm going to bring hatred back in. It's the other party is no longer just disagreeable. Back when I was a kid, Democrats and Republicans disagreed with each other, but now they see the other side as dangerous. Large majorities of both Republicans and Democrats report the other party makes them feel afraid, angry, and frustrated. In this last piece, strong majorities think that the other party's policies are, quote, so misguided that they threaten the nation's very well-being. So you can imagine why elections take on a much bigger cast than it did years ago. And again, the key thing is we're divided by something different. If we went back to the 1990s, it wouldn't be over 50%. It would be 15% who thought that the other party's policies were so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being. Susan made reference to Newt Gingrich and company. In 1994, they took over the House of Representatives. That year, 1994, 15% of Americans thought the other party's policies were so misguided that they threatened the nation's well-being. Now it's over 50. And this is something, basically where I'm going to end here. And it ends with hatred, which is, an unpleasant thing to think about. But what this is a picture of, and I'm going to explain it momentarily, this is a picture of hatred. So what I've done here is taken a survey question that has been, or 2 survey questions that have been asked all the way back to when Jimmy Carter was president. So this goes back to 1978. And what political scientists have done is ask people how to place on a feeling thermometer, which goes from 0 to 100 with 50 in the middle, and people can choose any number between 0 and 100. And they actually roll out a thermometer for somebody and show them and say, this is, what I want you to fill in. And they ask about 20 or 30 different groups in society. 2 of those groups are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So what I've done here is taken the average score during the Carter presidency, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, and calculated the average score about how Democrats feel about Democrats, how Republicans feel about Republicans. Now, polarization has been taking place and growing since the early 2000s. But note this, Democrats' feelings about Democrats and Republicans' feelings about Republicans have grown. They haven't changed. They've been basically the same over the course of the whole period. In other words, during this period of polarization, we don't love our side more. But look what's happened since the Bush presidency, second Bush presidency, in terms of how we feel about the other side. This broken red line is how Republicans feel about the Democratic Party, and this broken blue line is how Democrats feel about the Republican Party. And whereas the average score used to be about 40 degrees, and 50 is the midpoint of the scale, now these averages are under 20 degrees during at the end of the Trump presidency. So just to put that 20 degrees into perspective, what does 20 degrees on a feeling thermometer mean? And it's a hard thing to put into words. But back in the 1970s, the NES, the National Election Study, asked a bunch of questions about like really wacky groups, like people who riot in the streets, marijuana users. They got average scores of around 20 degrees. So in other words, Democrats feel about Republicans and Republicans feel about Democrats the way Americans felt about people who rioted in the streets in the 1970s. I think that that's hatred. And what I want you to think about, now that, we've pointed up that we don't love our side more, we just hate the other side more. Think about how pernicious this whole process is. When you really hate somebody or another sports team, I'm a Red Sox fan, I teach at UNC, so I love UNC, but I really hate Duke. I'm a Red Sox fan, so I really hate the Yankees. The world isn't, turned upside down, by, me hoping that Duke loses or the Yankees lose. But what if I'm a Republican and I'm rooting against the country to do well when Joe Biden is president? Or what if I'm a Democrat when Donald Trump was president and I'm rooting for the country not to do well? And that's what hatred does. It causes us to hope for the worst. And that's not usually a problem if it's sports or, something like that. But when it's the country, we got some real problems. Now, escaping worldview politics is going to be really hard. Polarization actually has historically been more the rule than the exception. The period when the group of us probably mostly grew up was that exceptional period from the 1930s to the 1980s, during much of that time being the Cold War. And we came to think, oh, that's normal, but that hasn't really been normal. And I'll say this too, and we'll talk about this maybe more in the Q&A. Party leaders today don't have little incentive to change. Their approach change their approach when both sides are tied. What if they get it wrong if they change their approach? And what if, like the Republicans in the House and Senate, compromise with the Democrats, who are the majority party, and hold the White House? Are the Republicans going to get the credit for having compromised? No, in fact, the Democrats will. So in a sense, there are these perverse incentives tied into a tied political system where the minority party has no incentive to cooperate. But change is always possible. One party might take a decisive edge. A new generation of leaders might take us in a different direction. But the last thing that I'm going to close with is talking about, how I think, we might come up with the antidote. And it's encouraging people who are within one party who might kind of be heretics to make sure that their voices are heard. So the pandemic created this very interesting moment as it relates to polarization. Public health people had no idea about what to do with political polarization as it relates to a pandemic. Of course, Republicans had, kind of said, well, the pandemic's not such a big deal. Democrats said, oh man, it's a really big deal. But it's an interesting thing because Donald Trump should get a lot of credit for having led Operation Warp Speed and getting vaccines ready in the United States before they were ready almost any place else. And he got vaccinated. So if we think about politics as ordinary people following the leader, maybe we could get Republicans to get vaccinated if we made them aware of the fact that Donald Trump got vaccinated. So here at UNC and with a group of collaborators at Stanford and Cal Berkeley, we created a public service announcement starring Donald Trump. And if everything goes right, it might even play for you. Now, let's see how this goes. And we're going to skip that verification process.
If you were hospitalized while away from home, a Fly You Home membership can transport you to the. Donald Trump is urging all Americans to receive the COVID-19 vaccine.
I would recommend it, and I would recommend it to a lot of people that don't want to get it, and a lot of those people voted for me, frankly.
Both Trump and former First Lady Melania Trump did receive their vaccines privately in January at the White House.
So we ran that ad with $100,000 worth of money that we won from something called the Vaccine Confidence Fund. And we delivered it in 1,000 or so low vaccination counties, and didn't run it in another 1,000 low vaccination counties. And then we compared after the month that it ran, what happened to average vaccine uptake in the two different types of counties. And what our estimates show is that we, with that ad, increased vaccination uptake by about 104,000 shots. So what we had was a Republican talking to other Republicans in a way that shrunk polarization. We did the same thing with mask wearing, but instead of using a Republican politician, we used a Republican-oriented group, in this case, the military, and a general who's retired here in the Raleigh area, to endorse masks in a PSA. And we got this big increase in positive feelings about masks as well. So what I think we need to do, because people on the left don't trust people on the right, and people on the right don't trust people on the left, but not all people on the left and the right agree with each other. So the best cue givers, the best way for us to overcome these differences and to shrink differences is to have Democrats who disagree talking to other Democrats, and Republicans who disagree talking with other Republicans. Anyway, I'm sure that that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to bring this to an end, stop sharing my screen, and open things up for questions. Thank you very much. What do I do? Stop the share.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. Can everybody hear me? I think so. Right. Great talk. And I think what people don't see is how many years you've been working on this and how much data goes behind what was really a really elegant, interesting presentation. So I'll start with a really hard question, because I'm going to ask you all the questions my students ask me that I can't answer, is how much what is Trump's unique contribution to the polarization, and how much of it was on some kind of it was kind of linked to what's been happening in the last few decades, and was probably going in that direction anyway due to various factors. What does he bring specially, if anything? We're such a country of, we believe in like great man theories of history. We always think that we're taught in K-12 that presidents really change stuff. They really do stuff. They can reorient a whole culture. Can you bat that around a little bit?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of thoughts, Susan. I'd be really interested to know what you think about this too, because you probably have, with your background and training, way more to say about this than I do. But here's the thing. First of all, I think we want to look at not why Trump was attractive to so many people, because my sense is if the person has an R next to their name it could be, you know, a can of tomatoes, and Republicans would be enthusiastic about that can of tomatoes as long as it was against the Democrats. And the same is true about Democrats relative, what's the old thing about voting for a yellow dog? As long as it's a Democrat, I'll vote for a yellow dog. All right, so let's not think about, Trump's appeal to Republicans. Where I think he is, what he contributes to, and what, hopefully the slide showed is, boy, Democrats hated him like nobody's business. And, with some reason, this is one of the things that he is a figure that makes teaching, especially at a large public university, really complicated, because he's a really problematic figure. And, at public universities, it's really, really important to take into account both sides. But there are certain things that I think we just can't countenance. And, he is engaged in some of those things. So that's a tough one. But, January 6th, you could go through any number of different things, the 30,000 lies, the whatever it is, or false or misleading statements. This is a big deal. Democrats, he's a lightning rod for Democrats. I personally think that Republicans, there are certain Republicans that just love the guy, he's new and different. But if we go back to 2016 and think, were the Republicans really lining up to vote for this guy to be their leader? No, the reason he won is because there were like 17 candidates in the Republican field, and he has talent, he's got panache, he's got, some dash. And the other thing that he is like, he's in your face. And if you hate the Democrats, which Republicans do, he's your guy, because he's just giving them the bird all day long. And, that feels really good. You want somebody who is willing to do that in a way that maybe, you feel powerless to do. So, I've often said this, 2024 election, Democrats are thinking, oh God, it could be Trump again. And, I think he's the guy who Democrats would actually have the easiest time beating, because he's, done so many things that are a little bit problematic, or more than a little problematic. So I feel like that's the way to think about Trump. It's not really thinking about, how much Republicans loved him. It's just like, he was their guy, who stood up to the Democrats who were always making fun of us, like that Dan Para quote that I shared.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the many books that I wish I wrote that I did is that Adam Sewer book. He's a journalist for The Atlantic. The cruelty is the
Yes.
point.
Yeah, I haven't read it.
I think just telling the audience here about the title, I think you know what it's about. Yeah. It's about the schadenfreude, the joy, you called it the panache, the fun that Trump was having with, and followers are having with, the kind of the cruelty, the making fun, the mocking. It's one of the things I find most worrisome. Yeah. And cruelty kind of puts, so I think if you're going to argue about what Trump brought uniquely, it was a kind of permission slip to do the cruel kind of discourse and to have fun with it. And so, defending it, you could say, well, it's just in good fun. Mm-hmm. And in being against it, you could say that's, it's pretty worrisome. Because, I always thought Americans I thought they were generally nice until recently. Yeah. And, not so sure we're so neighborly and kind anymore.
Yeah, well, and this gets at one of the things that I think is really important too. And I think it's really consistent with your idea here, Susan, and that is we don't live close to each other anymore. Like, when my mom and dad, my mom just passed away, but, my dad's 94 years old, and he lived in a city block in Woodside, Queens, and there were Republicans on the block and there were Democrats on the block. And, they probably just didn't talk about politics because, that's not what polite people did. But now, the Republicans live in the country and the Democrats live in the city, and there's just not that kind of contact. And I think one of the things that comes from that is discrimination, prejudice. I mean, we think about prejudice as being something that we might wield at racial or ethnic groups. But I think Republicans and Democrats are doing that to each other these days. Now, what's the best way to get over prejudice? It's contact, having contact, so that people realize that, we disagree about this and we look different or whatever, but, we're still good people. But that's, we don't have that contact between Republicans and Democrats anymore.
Yeah, and we are, so folks on the call, in political science, we talk about sorting and how people sort themselves, where they want to live, what kind of neighborhood, what state they want to live in, what media they watch. And so we are part of this too, where we find it really hard to, you don't want to talk to someone from the other side. It's just like an uncomfortable, and like, I'm not going to persuade them anyway. You don't really want to watch the media, the cable channel from the other side, because you're not going to agree with it. It's going to make you depressed. You're not going to know what to do with it. So, we accelerate the sorting process that may be already there a bit.
Yep.
Every issue that lands in American politics now gets immediately polarized. Sides get polarized. So most recently, today and yesterday, Joe Biden introduced this loan forgiveness for college students, federal loans. They could get $10,000, some cases with Pell Grants, even $20,000 of debt erased. And boy, that hit the air, and it's like it immediately the two sides started to to gear up. Is there, how can we stop that kind of immediate, it gets jumped on right away as a divisive issue, instead, like there is no moment for rational discourse? The space just disappeared within 24 hours from what I could tell.
Yeah, I hate to be a wet blanket here but I don't know that we can. I don't know that there's much to be done given the media environment, the ecosystem, the fundraising ecosystem. Of course, Donald Trump raised millions of dollars by, writing about the FBI seizing things from his, that were classified documents that were in his possession. That kind of stuff wouldn't have happened, back when there were the 3 networks and, there was no Twitter and, all of that kind of thing. So I think that the system has changed so much that we can't expect that. But I will say this, Susan, 2 things. One is, I think in a 2-party system, there's always a tendency toward that, right? Because, and in a tied 2-party system, there's a tendency toward that. So, my dad, I said earlier, was a longtime political hand in Pennsylvania politics. And he worked for, Hugh Scott, who is the Republican leader of the Senate in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Washington. And, Hugh Scott and Mike Mansfield, the Democratic leader, used to get together for breakfast at the beginning of every week on Monday in the Senate dining room and plan the calendar together. That was, what they did. But why did they do that? Well, it's because the Democrats had no chance of losing the Senate. They held, 60, 65 seats at times. There was no hope that Scott and the Republicans would ever have the majority. So under those circumstances, the minority, they have the incentive to cooperate. I might not be able to get everything that I want, but I'm not going to win the next election, so I'm never going to get that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cooperate with Mike Mansfield and see if I can get a piece of what I want. But now, since we're tied, and Mitch McConnell looks at the situation and says, look, I can win that next election. I'm not doing anything to help you guys out. And Chuck Schumer did the same thing to Mitch McConnell when the Democrats were in the majority, or in the minority. We never get that cooperation, that takes place. So part of it, so if one side took a big lead, which isn't going to happen anytime soon, we might get more cooperation and less of that knee-jerk partisan reaction. But, absent that, I don't know how that happens.
So we have a good question here from Bob Shapiro. He's a professor at Columbia. Excellent talk. What's missing from the discussion is partisans' differences in perceptions of reality. What's true, what's false, etc. The famous Kellyanne Conway, the alternative facts. How did all this come about? The inability to agree on what is empirically real.
So I think, Bob, thanks so much for the question, and thanks so much for the generous comment about the talk. I think hatred is actually a big part of this, actually. So, I go back to the person who I hate. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I really hate him, okay? if I hear anything about that person, am I willing to believe it? Yeah. Especially if it's bad, if it's good, am I willing to, wave it away? Absolutely, because I don't want to believe those things. And when you really intensely hate, in this case, a political party, I think you're willing to believe anything that's in your media ecosystem, no matter how crazy it might be. Good example is, 60% of Republicans up until recently, at least, and it may still be the case, believe that the election was stolen. There's no evidence, for that. Donald Trump and Republican leaders say that that's true. So, they want to believe that that's true. And so what I would say is what hatred does is it causes people to reason with extreme bias. So you don't want to think, that the world is different from the way you want it to be, when the alternative is to advantage the group that you hate. So, Bob is one person who's done, lots of work on like economic perceptions of the perceptions of the economy. They're meaningless now among Republicans and Democrats for the most part, because when the Democrats are in, the Democrats say the economy's great, even if it's terrible. And if the Republicans are in, they say the economy's in the dumper, even if it's great. So, a lot of this is motivation to see the world the way that you want to see it. And I think that's fueled by thinking the other side is dangerous and that their policy ideas are misguided.
Well, so Mark, on the economy and on inflation, we were brought up to believe as political scientists that, how people were doing inflation, pocketbook issues mattered immensely. They would always trump, excuse me, it would be nice to use that word again regularly, always trump social issues, typically, because it really gets people where it hurts when they're suffering economically. What do you think is going to happen, this fall and these next few years? Someone in the chat brought up libraries banning books, and critical race theory is brought up, I think. Obviously, abortion is one of our big cultural divides. Given that there is worry that it's based in reality about the economy and about inflation, how's that going to play out? The balance among those two things. I mean, will people really, is pocketbook issue voting over, or
No, I don't think so. But I think it's over for a larger segment of the public than before. So in other words, when you're almost tied like we are, let's say that we're 45-45, but there are these 10% of people who aren't in one camp or the other. What those 10% decide is really, really important. The 90%, none of these things, are probably going to affect very much. But if the economy is bad enough, if current conditions are bad enough, and that last 10% breaks 8-2 or 7-3 for one side, then it's a disaster, for the side that didn't get the 8 or the 7. It's a 4 or a 6 point win. And in this, environment, that could produce, really big changes to the world. So, I still think the fundamentals matter, but mostly just because we're so tied. But that being said, and this is something I wonder what you guys think about a little bit. I've been batting this around a little bit. Like, the economy, we used to have bigger swings, in economic outcomes, and it wasn't even all that long ago. But one thing I wonder about is if the relative wealth, and I mean wealth, of the United States provides now relative to the past, provides a buffer, for more people who used to be more affected by the economic outcomes. So, back in, now, even when you're doing bad, you still have a car, you still have a big TV, you still, have, these creature comforts that in the Great Depression, or, even in the disastrous economies of the late 1950s, people didn't have it made. No, I'm not saying that everybody has it made in the United States. I'm just saying, that in a sense, people have more stuff, and I wonder if it makes them feel less sensitive to those types of things. I don't know if that's right, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, it's funny. I was teaching in Germany the last few months, and the students were arguing to me, okay, we're talking about post-war Germany, what's happened the last few decades in Germany and other states that are kind of social welfare states like that. They argued that German politics can never get like ours and too crazy and too extreme because people have free healthcare, they have free childcare, they have free higher education. So there's in like the NIH and in the UK, people feel like their lives are not threatened by the kind of debates that go on in politics, and that leads to a more kind of rational, less polarized, less hateful, less cruel politics.
Yeah.
I don't know. I thought it was a good argument, and they articulated it better than I do because they, they're thinking about it more. Now, Randy Block here in the chat has a question I always ask to my students. To cross the divide, do we need some kind of traumatic event like Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, that only an alien invasion could unite us, could unite the world? And it's wild because we do have a test case of the pandemic. Yeah. Okay, it's not an alien. And I don't think that an alien invasion would bring America together. Yeah. I mean, one side would say, are they really aliens? Are they really dangerous? They seem fine to me. I went on their spaceship and it was all good. And the other side would be, it's hard, it was a shock that the pandemic couldn't bring us together. It was something we were all fighting, at once.
Yeah, you could have imagined, that, maybe mask wearing or social distancing could have become like the modern day equivalent of victory gardens, or, something along those lines, where people just made sacrifices, for the other. And I would add, Susan, I think you're 100% right. And it's not just viruses, we had the Great Recession in the late 2000s. We had like about 2 seconds worth of good feelings. We had the 9/11 attacks, and we didn't really come together for more than a heartbeat, after those either. It's hard to imagine, a set of circumstances that changes that. It's I don't know what external event it would be. And,
it's not going to be some day.
And you're nodding at like a media environment where we one thing that we don't do any longer is, experience the same reality, of the 3 major networks and, stuff like that. We don't necessarily receive the same information, the same signals in the same way. And that complicates matters even more.
Now, David Ferris has a good question. When he's asking about your research on the fixed versus fluid folks and that divide, how do those 2 different worldviews or mindsets see democracy? I mean, I think that's what he's asking, and value democracy versus authoritarianism, I guess.
Yeah. So it's one of those classic questions in a way. It depends. But what's for certain is that the fixed have much weaker connections to democratic norms. But that's not to say that most people who are fixed or would be fine with a military dictatorship or anything like that. This is in some of the later chapters of Prius or Pickup. It's just that the fixed have less connection to, democratic norms than, the fluid do. Now, when we did most of this surveying, the Democrats were in power, so, that probably had something to do with it. But even when Trump was in power, the idea of a strongman leader who doesn't have to worry about legislature, military rule, things like that, the fixed were significantly more okay, with the sort of non-democratic setups. But I don't want to go too far with that, because it's not like most Republicans or most Democrats are in favor of any of these things. They're pretty fringe positions, in the 15 and 20% range.
I wonder with the midterms are so idiosyncratic, state by state, district by district, but I do wonder in the next presidential election whether any of the candidates on either side, assuming that both sides have multiple candidates and we don't get a replay of 2020, whether the discourse of I'll be the president for everybody, it's time to bring the country together. What did Obama say? There's no red, it's not a red America and a blue America, it's one America. That used to be just a staple, a standard thing that any candidate would say. I wonder if anybody even goes there anymore in the general election next time around.
That's a great question. And you remember this too, Susan, when growing up, Republicans and Democrats never put Republican or Democrat in their lawn signs or in their ads. I mean, partisanship was a really bad thing. We were supposed to be one. And now, I mean, unless it's a purple district or a purple state, everybody's got their, party connected to their name and their sign and everything these days. So, I'm to the extent that rhetoric wins votes from a given candidate, but it would have to be sort of like a white knight type of candidate, who, rides, in from the East or whatever it is. It couldn't be somebody who is an established politician, it would have to be somebody who came from outside the system to say, look, like Ross Perot did in 1992, it would be a different character than him, but, I'm going to get underneath the hood and fix it. We need to come together to fix these problems. These problems are too big. And one thing, Susan, I wonder what you think about this. What do you think about, like, my students, and I'm sure your students too, are really, really worried about climate change and the effects of climate change. Do we reach a point where climate change reaches some sort of a tipping point and, it redraws the boundaries between, what people go together, in politics? Does that create a challenge that we need to pull together for? Or do we end up with, like, a fight in the United States between districts that have water and districts that need water, and so forth? I mean, I just don't know.
I think it's going to take more time. Right now, the extreme weather that we're seeing as a result of climate change, people can still write that off to it was just a really hot summer. Or we just had really bad fires, and maybe it's still not real enough. It's not comprehensive enough. It's not hitting people hard enough. We're a big country. It's just not enough people being affected. Oh, Rhoda, can I ask you how much time we have? I can't remember what our end time is.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We have time. We usually go till around 9 o'clock. What I'm very concerned about is I'm noting that there's quite a few questions in the Q&A thing, and I don't know how many of them we've addressed. Maybe
I'm gonna.
Why don't you scan that?
Yeah.
And, because I'd like to make sure that as many of the questions get answered. So if you could do that, Susan, that would be great.
Sure.
And,
absolutely.
I think we can go as long as it takes, and people can leave as they feel like it.
Okay.
So thank
Sounds
you.
Good. Yeah, no, I'm just eyeing this one from Diane. Sorry if I'm going to mispronounce your name. Scarangella. And she asks how much of this manipulation by political parties and politicians and the politicians they fund support, how many Republican legislators admit behind closed doors that the election was won by Biden, and they go to the podium voicing the opposite. And is this a disservice to all Americans? So there's a lot of questions in there, but maybe we should pull out of there the business of money and winning, which Mark, you brought up. but maybe you could spend more time on the personal calculus that these folks have that make in their desire to stay in office, their unbelievable desire to stay in office,
Yeah.
and how that adds to the bigger picture.
Well, God knows. I mean, it's a hugely important thing. And let's for the time being, let's not think about specific politicians. But if you think the other side is a danger to the United States, and that their policies are so misguided, that it's going to cause a danger to the country, then what wouldn't you do, to win, in a sense? So now let's think about, specific politicians. Do I think, Yale and Harvard law educated Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz think the election was stolen? No, there's no way in the world they do. But, they are going to continue to do that because they represent people who want to believe that. And, they know that, that's the way for them to win votes. And, one thing that I think would maybe be useful to touch on here, and I'll bring money into this in a minute, but, we have two big parties. And what we used to think when, we were young was two big parties created moderation, right? Because, you had to create a big tent. Well, what we've learned lately is that, when the party will put up with anything that their leaders do, as long as the other side doesn't win, then that doesn't lead to moderation. It could lead to extremity. So your students in Germany, they're not going to have what we have in the United States, in part because they have a multi-party system. And so, they have a racist, proto-Nazi party in the AfD. And the AfDs, might get 12% in a good year. But nobody wants to make a coalition with them. No one's going to put them in government. Nobody's going to do it. So there's a safety valve there. But let's say, in Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, we have two characters. One won their party nomination and one almost won their party nomination. And would all the Democrats have voted for Sanders if he won? Yeah, because he wasn't running again. He wasn't Trump. And would every Republican vote for Trump? Yeah, because he's not Biden. So it's this is a problem. But where the money comes in is we talk about interested money. There's no fundraising machine for the radical middle. It's just not a thing, right? Interested money has a point of view. It has an ideology, that's kind of connected to it. And, the people who are best able to tap into those networks tend to be the more extreme members. So I was talking about, my dad's old boss, Hugh Scott. Hugh Scott was what you would call back in the day a middleman. He was right in the middle of his caucus. Didn't matter if he was a good fundraiser or not, because fundraising wasn't really important. Fast forward 20, 25 years, who did the Democrats turn to as their leader? Nancy Pelosi. What is she? She's really extreme. She's from San Francisco, for God's sake. She doesn't look extreme now, but she was really extreme when she became the Democrats' leader. Why would they give this liberal from San Francisco the opportunity to run the party? Because she's really good at raising money. And the Republicans had their version of that, and Tom DeLay and Dick Armey. These guys were two of the very most conservative members of the House, and they were leaders. How? Because they could bring in the cash. And, that, process just continues to play itself out.
It's a good moment to ask about a third party, which is seems impossible in the United States. Why is that? There is a group of David Jolly, for example, former congressman from Florida, who's a very kind of thoughtful, moderate Republican, and colleagues of his that are moderate Democrats. And they really are trying to make a go of it on a third party that would be kind of the moderate party. I don't know if they have a name for it yet. That's not gonna, I don't think that's gonna work. But why is that? Why can't a moderate, if most Americans are moderate, why can't that work?
Yeah, I think that's just such an important question to both ask and answer. And again, it kind of goes back to our two-party system. And let's go back to the 2000 election, between Al Gore and George W. Bush, when this guy, Ralph Nader, a third-party candidate, got involved. And he didn't win very many votes. He only won about 2%. But his presence in the election flipped Florida to the Republicans, and that was decisive, and it ended up winning the election for the Republicans. So, third parties, by getting involved, might end up causing their side to actually lose, the election. So Liz Cheney right now is, now talking about running for president. Running in the primary makes no sense at all. But if she ran in the general and say 3 or 4% of Republicans voted for her instead of Trump, then any Democrat, a yellow dog, would win, the presidency. So what it comes down to is this, third parties, you don't get anything for coming in second place in the United States or third place in the United States. So, in Germany, you come in second place and you get proportional representation in the legislature. Get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats. Well, we'll go back to 1992 and talk about Ross Perot, who got 20% of the vote almost, and he got bupkis, because he didn't win any states. He came in second in a couple, third in most. But, if you don't get anything for coming in second, then there are no incentives for, a third party to be able to form.
Liz Cheney is, she's doing incredible work. She's a very, very courageous woman. She's very impressive on so many dimensions, and it's really astounding. But I keep waiting for her rhetoric to turn to something that might address polarization. I mean, I think, what she's trying to argue is that, put aside that I'm a very conservative person, you may not be other people on the January 6th committee or, Democrats, but we all care about, democracy, and are protecting the rule of law, and democracy is over everything. We should all care about that. Wish she would turn it a little more toward we believe in this together. And look, if it's not in her nature, or she's not to it yet, or for whatever reason, and like, I said, she's doing yeoman's work, she's doing enough already, but that would be super interesting to take this as a wedge to, try to address why are we all Americans? The much deeper question.
Well, Susan, I think that's such a good point. And I think the notion that it might have a positive impact is evidence for that is the advertising campaign that we did using Trump as a spokesperson for vaccines, right? Could Liz Cheney talk to other Republicans about the fact that, we need to do something about this polarization. We need to take things down a notch. Not all Republicans would be on board with that, but some would. She would have sway with them. And, you could imagine somebody on the left, a character maybe like Cory Booker or Elizabeth Spansberger or somebody like that, playing a similar role on the left to other Democrats. Right now, I don't see anybody who can talk to the whole country and unify us that way. But I think that, a Mitt Romney would be another, terrific source of moderation. Cheney's politics is not moderate at all, right? She's very, very conservative. But she could talk to Republicans about, how, problematic this rhetoric is, and the dehumanization, and where this led us. And I can tell you, as the son of a lifelong Republican, my dad is horrified by what happened on January 6th. He's looking for a spokesperson to say those types of things. Now, he's not going to vote for a Democrat ever, but he's, he would really like to see his people do it differently.
So this is a tough one from Sandy Silverberg. There are plenty of Republicans who are not Trumpers. Who from that side do you consider an emerging leader follow up, lots of factions in the Democratic Party as well. Same question: who are the emerging leaders? So this is where we, you get to make predictions, and then we come back to you in a couple of years and give you a cash prize.
I can tell you, only one time in my life have I ever gotten a prediction right. On my first day of class teaching at Bowdoin College in 1998, I told my students, because I had just come from Texas, and I said George Bush will be the next president. And it's been all downhill from there. I just haven't gotten a thing correct since then. So I think the Democratic side is really interesting because I think Biden only runs if Trump runs. I think he'll step aside if Trump does not run because he's a million years old, and it's got to be really hard. And I think the way that Biden thinks about himself is the guy who saved the country, from Trump. He might've been the only guy that could have beaten him. And like you said, there are a million, different Democrats who, could possibly emerge. I mentioned Cory Booker's name. I love that guy. He would be somebody who I think speaks the right language of, compromise and conciliation, but it didn't get any traction in, 2020. So I don't know why I should, think he'd do better this time. But, we'll have to see. And, it's funny, like, we now think about senators as the, people who become president. It used to be governors. They were the only ones, so we should probably be looking to the state level for, the type of talent. And on the Republican side, the person who seems best positioned to pick up the mantle for Trump is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who seems a lot like Trump in terms of his rhetoric and approach. But, he doesn't have the history of, frankly, Trump has a history of lawlessness in his business life and his personal life. And, we don't see that in DeSantis. So, maybe we would get the sort of style of politics that, Trump has, but without the sideshow. So I have no idea who will emerge among the Democrats. I have absolutely no idea. I think, Booker has talent and such, but, I have no idea. And I think DeSantis would be, very tough to beat if Trump doesn't run. If Trump runs, though, it'll be him. I mean, maybe even if he's
they'll clear out. Yeah, the rest of them will clear out. Someone asked me, well, what if, Liz Cheney wanted to be in it against, Trump was running, can she get it? I said, it's up to the state party.
Yeah.
They don't have to put her on the ballot.
That's a good point. And even if they did, so, you guys in the audience, you're probably thinking, God, Hetherington, he looks like somebody. Who is it? I'll tell you who it is. It's John Kasich. Okay.
That's who
it is.
Yeah.
Western Pennsylvania guy. Anyway, I was checking in for my flight in New Orleans a number of years ago, and I gave my ID to the gate attendant, and the gate attendant said, "Not Marc Hetherington, you're John Kasich. I just saw you on television, last night." But John Kasich didn't get too many votes, and he would be the Liz Cheney, sort of candidate. Just like, who is Martin O'Malley was supposed to be, that candidate for the Democrats in 2016. Jim Webb, they were around for like 10 minutes and, that was it. So, but like you said, but here's, Susan, this is something I brought up with my students. I wonder what you think about this. We grew up in a time where the parties mattered so much and the establishment, they could keep control of it, and they can't anymore. I mean, Trump is not the establishment. Obama wasn't the establishment in 2008. Bernie isn't the establishment. He came this close twice. I mean, it's wacky and wild, under these circumstances. I mean, who knows?
What's that book? It's got to be 30 years old now. I think it's Marty Wattenberg. He argued that television is so powerful because it gives candidates the chance to speak over the party elite. And it was kind of getting true, but now it's really true.
Now it's really true. With the internet, it's just so totally true.
It was a debatable argument. Now it's, it's without question.
Yeah, and you can raise money on the internet, from donors that you couldn't reach, back in the sort of television age too. So what Marty was getting at was right, and now it's like supercharged because, you know, the non-establishment people can get a lot of cash and be
Yeah, I mean,
viable.
I think he was writing before cable. I mean, I think
I think he
writing
was too.
before Fox. Yeah.
Yeah, it was right around when I started graduate school, so you know, it was a long time ago.
Rhoda, it looks like you're
Yeah,
you're on to the
I
season.
jumped in because I just want to touch base with you, Susan. How are we doing on the questions? Most of them addressed, or is any?
There's too many.
There's a lot of questions.
There's a lot of
Does
questions.
any
and-
stand out that maybe weren't covered in either the presentation or this great discussion that you can?
There's more, you know, there's a few questions that are getting at the media. So maybe,
Yeah.
Mark, you can talk a little bit about Fox, MSNBC, CNN. I mean, this is the kind of group that are on the line here that probably are paying attention to cable news. I mean, our students don't, but they see, you know, on YouTube or where, you know, they get in their feeds, they do see cable news, even if little bits.
I think it's super interesting, right? So, you know, and there's some really interesting and exciting research on this, which I did not conduct, but I think is so cool. So let's talk about cable news first, you know, so the Fox and MSNBC thing. So, you know, for decades, you know, these forces have been around literally for a couple decades, right? But here's the thing, you know, if they're the root of the problem, it's pretty weird because almost nobody watches those things. You know, more people than, you know, you might guess watch them, but I'm sure the most high rated television program on whether it's network TV or elsewhere gets 4 times the viewership, you know, as Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, at least. So it's not like they're dominant, but this is where the research comes in. It turns out that people don't actually have to watch those programs themselves to get polarized by them. They just have to be in social networks with people who watch those programs. So, and if you're in, say, a homogenous social network in, you know, in a rural area somewhere, so you're probably going to be around a bunch of other people who are conservative. There's one guy, one woman who's watching Fox, and they talk about this with, you know, the social group over, you know, a beer and bowling, then it's going to polarize the whole group. And if you're in the city and, you know, there's, you know, one real Rachel Maddow devotee and you guys get together over Thai food and talk about what the person saw on Rachel, then it's polarizing everybody. So that's really, you know, something that even though we don't get a lot of eyeballs on those shows, you know, they're still, you know, driving people apart. The other part of this is social media, you know, which is, you know, we tend to think, and we're right, you know, and, you know, I'm on Facebook sometimes when I'm not upset at Facebook, but am I in a pretty homogenous political ecosystem? Yeah, because I'm a professor and, you know, most professors are pretty liberal. And the same is true of, you know, people who are in, you know, conservative ecosystems. But here's the thing that's interesting. It's not being reinforced by other conservatives or other liberals that makes you more polarized. If you guys experience this, I'm sure this is going to be familiar. There's one like crazy uncle or crazy aunt, you know, who's in your ecosystem, who's so out there in the other direction. And you're like, oh my God, you know, that person really cares enough to post on Facebook, you know, about this stuff. But here's where the problem comes in. Is that person like usual conservatives, or is that person really actually way out there? We tend to think that person is representative of the other side, and they're not. You know, they're way out there, they're wacky, they're crazy, but we tend to think as a result of seeing their posts, oh, you know, they're all like that, and they're not, you know. In fact, it's just Crazy Earl, you know, who's, you know, in the, you know, been in the whiskey and, you know, is saying all sorts of things.
Yeah, and it's too bad we can't weight people's opinions by how much information they have or their mental state or so let's see. maybe Rhoda, one more question, time for one
Okay,
more question?
I think so. One more question is good. And then perhaps those questions that were not answered or covered in the program, if the person named themselves, we could probably get them answered. So,
Okay.
yeah,
What
one more.
about this
Yeah,
one?
please feel free,
They could
you know-
write to us too by email.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. If you have a question that you really have a burning desire to ask me about and I don't get to it, just drop me a note. I was going to write in
Well,
the
they
chat.
can send it to us at nfrpp.org.
okay.
And we'll
Yeah,
forward
you
it.
get it to me and I'll
Yeah.
get back to you as soon
And
as I
we're
can.
going to check the questions and do the same. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. So this is from Lee Chinitz, hope that's right. Didn't Donald Trump get booed at his own rally when he talked about the fact that he got vaccinated? So this is right up your alley, Mark, because of the ad that you guys produced.
Yep.
It seems like once people are polarized, they will disagree even with people who are supposed to be on their side. So it's a kind of you can't rein them back in.
This is such a great observation.
Even Trump can't rein them back in. Yeah.
Yeah, this is such a great point. But here's the thing, and this I think illustrates the point that I just made, is we tend, like, whether it's the person who doesn't agree with us in our Facebook network or the people we see at a Trump rally or a Biden rally on television, we think they are representative of the other side, and they're not. They're just not. So let me ask a couple of questions. This is a parlor game here. So what percentage of Republicans do you think supported mask mandates? 70%, not 17, 70. Now, what percentage of Republicans are vaccinated? Do you think it's more or less than a majority? It's way more. So here's the thing. Who goes to a Trump rally? Not people like that. They're from the fringes. I mean, just like anybody who goes to a political rally, these are people who care deeply and have, they're true believers. But those aren't the people that we're trying to reach. The people that we're trying to reach are different from that. So I'm not surprised, that the true believers booed Trump about his vaccine status. They were probably stunned, to find out that he was not one of them on the vaccine issue. But we're never going to change those minds about vaccines. But there are a bunch of Republicans who politics is not their life. And they just didn't know Trump was vaccinated. And when they learned he was, they're like, oh, all right, I should probably get vaccinated. So I think it's really important. And Susan, you made this point earlier. Most Americans are moderate. They don't have, polar opinions about much. They just think that the other side has, their opponents have, weigh out their opinions. So, you're not going to change the minds of the people on the extremes, but maybe we can talk to the people in the middle.
Absolutely.
That sounds very hopeful, doesn't it? Should we
Good
close on
luck.
that note? Is that what you would like to leave the audience with?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you both. This was extraordinary presentation, Mark, and a great discussion, Susan and Mark. I know we learned a lot. And on that hopeful note, we can go forward.
Well, Rhoda, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan.
Mark.
It was my pleasure and an honor for NFRPP to have you both. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.
Good night.